Hello, everyone. I'm George Kors, and today we are talking about Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Idiot, perhaps David Bowie's favorite book. I'll get into that later, and also a deep dive that I have promised you folks here. A little bit back, I did a deep dive on why you should be reading Dostoevsky. I talked about Dostoevsky's four masterworks in that video. That video is linked down below. Dostoevsky wrote in a very prescient way for our contemporary moment. I think for Americans out there, I think for Europeans out there who are experiencing a kind of madness by seeing our federal and governmental institutions descend into their own sort of chaotic natures, Dostoevsky is a really timely and important read for you. And I'm going to do deep dives on all four of those masterworks that Dostoevsky did in the 19th century, and we're going to start with The Idiot. The Idiot is the second chronologically of those four, coming out in the 19th century in the late life period of Dostoevsky after Crime and Punishment. Now, this novel, to my taste, is perhaps the most personal of the four, and I've seen a lot of critics and academics talk about how The Idiot might be a deeply personal novel for Dostoevsky himself in the writing of it. And we're not going to get too autobiographical with Dostoevsky today, but we're going to talk a little bit about some thematic elements that are dealing with Dostoevsky's personal experiences in his own life. So Dostoevsky was arrested and sent to Siberia. This is one of the novels written after that arrest, and it really does show the marks of a person who is deeply traumatized by these experiences. You can tell I took a lot of notes in here, and that's because I really felt a deep emotional sensibility in this novel. More so than I felt in Crime and Punishment, more so than I felt in Demons, and more so than Brothers Karamazov, which is saying a lot. I think of all four of those masterworks, The Idiot is, to my taste, the most emotionally affecting of all four of them. And that is because there are some particular characters in here that I must highlight right off the bat. I'm not going to do too much summary of the plot here. I'm going to let you experience the plot, and we're going to talk, as we usually do, about themes and characteristics today. And a few of those themes I want to introduce with our significant characters in the novel, with particularly with four. So with three main characters, as you might say, and one very important side character in the end. And the first is Prince Mishkin, who is the idiot. This is a well-to-do prince who has returned to Russia from a sanitarium in Switzerland and is being exposed to this major cultural change because he's not very familiar with Russian culture, having been away for so long. He was away for the sake of his health. And Mishkin returns, and almost on every page of the novel, I wrote it down here in my notes. On almost, you can see holy fool, idiot. I continued this elsewhere on this next page. These are all the instances where Mishkin or somebody is called an idiot, is called a fool. And the notion of idiot and fool here is highly ambiguous. This is coming from not only, what are many of my contemporary Americans might think of as like, okay, this person is unintelligent, is stupid, yada, 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 right? But also this notion of a holy fool, a person who is almost like a schlemiel, somebody who is, has their heart in the right place, but is, maybe their own worst enemy. And then also in Prince Mishkin's case, we have somebody who has a sense of duty, who has a sense of righteousness and morality, who is taken advantage of by those around him. When I tell you to prepare for how poorly the prince is treated throughout this novel, you need to mentally prepare yourselves for that. I rarely give Trigger warnings on this channel, and I rarely give a heads up. This is one of those novels. Almost on every single page, somebody is calling the prince a fool. They are calling him an idiot. They are being derisive of him. But it has that ambiguous and multitudinous sensibility behind it, where they might be insulting him intentionally, or they might also be sighing a heavy sigh and wishing that he was not acting in a certain way for his own good, for his own benefit. That is, the title is apt in that respect. And it is really difficult to read this, not necessarily because of the sentences. And I hear a lot of complaints out there about Dostoevsky's sentences. It is emotionally difficult to see this person, the prince, be abused time and time again, over and over and over. He is belittled and reduced to a caricature time and time again. And that might not sound appealing to you. I think, however, you might want to hear a little bit more about the prince before you make that judgment. The prince is this sort of representation of a duality between sickness and health. We're not sure, the prince is recovered, but is he recovered in a manner that he will long-term maintain his able-bodiedness? We're not sure. And that ties into his sort of mental wellness. This is a theme we see throughout a lot of 19th and 20th century literature of what constitutes healthiness, what constitutes being sick, what constitutes mental wellness, what constitutes being mentally sick, and so forth. There's a lot of complicated verbiage that we have contemporarily about that. As a person who, myself, I do a lot of therapy, this novel really hit home because the prince is having gone through his own sort of recovery for his own sickness. He has this vocabulary for himself psychologically that a lot of the other characters don't have about themselves. And I see the prince as almost the symbolic representation of somebody who's gone through therapy, really significantly changes, and then goes back to their family or friend group and realizes that not everybody shares this vocabulary when it comes to talking about one's own wellness. And I mean that serious. Now, wellness is a really bizarre, especially for my folks who are using social media, is a really bizarre term. I don't mean this in the grift sense of wellness, but actual, medical, your mental wellness or your physical wellness. And the prince has this vocabulary, I think, that is much more highly advanced about psychology than the other characters. And his responses to being called an idiot, responses to being called a fool, those are what are really, really important to me as a reader. Because in The Idiot, you see time and time again, somebody calls the prince an idiot, and the prince says, yes, and here's why. Yes, and here's my feelings. Yes, and here's my duty, my obligation. And that is really provocative to me. It's not necessarily that the prince is standing up for himself. It's not necessarily true that the prince is self-advocating. But what is true is that the prince has an understanding of self that is really important. And it's radical. And I think it's really, really eye-opening. To that end, I think the prince represents a kind of duty and moral obligation here. He really has these flushed out and nuanced feelings that are really complicated and really contrast with a lot of the individuals that he finds when he arrives in Russia. When he arrives and he starts making friends in society and making acquaintances and having these really complicated relationships with individuals, that I think is really, really just so interesting to get into psychologically. And it to me, it's some of Dostoevsky's best psychological writing in here. I was really, really impressed. This was the last of the four masterpieces that I read of Dostoevsky's, and I thought that The Idiot really had that psychological writing down extremely, extremely well. The other representation that Prince Myshkin has for me that I think is really important to highlight in The Idiot is his religiousness and his piety. As a pious sort of member of the Russian church, believer in the Russian God, I think he represents this moral certainty in Christianity, and the idiot of all of the four masterpieces by Dostoevsky, to me, has, outside of Brothers Karamazov, a lot of the most overt interplay between atheism and Christianity. And I read Dostoevsky as an atheist, and Dostoevsky is not kind to atheists, and that, is something that, as an atheist, I have to accept. But that interplay between atheism and Christianity, how, as a spiritual Christian, as a Russian Christian, Prince Mishkin interacts with atheists, that is really provocative stuff for me. Very, very interesting. And I see, in America, this is a controversial take, I see almost the reverse in the contemporary United States, where there are a lot of deeply hypocritical Christians and a lot of really moral atheists. That's another place where I think that reading contemporarily is really good. The second major character that I'd highlight here is Natasha Filipovna, and she is this foil to so many characters here. She is an object of obsession. For my folks who are looking at gender roles, there is a significant sort of gender role discussion to be had with Natasha, because I think Filipovna, she has this fierce intelligence and independence that is really counteracting a lot of typical gender expectations of the time. And then also we have the typical gender expectations of the time applied onto her. So if you are exploring gender roles, you're interested in something like that, a reading of Natasha Filipovna, I think would be really, really, could be really, really thoughtful, really productive. Natasha does represent almost a chaotic, destructive nature to me, where the prince seeks some sort of Christian order. Natasha really does have a more destructive nature that is much more chaotic. And I think that is really, seeing how the prince interacts with that, with the prince's moral certitude, is really interesting. Obviously Natasha, this is a 19th century novel. Natasha has a beauty and suffering element as well. This is one of those classic tropes we see again and again applied to women characters. That is here in spades, of course. We also have that deep obsession that male characters have there. That heteronormative trope is here, of course, as well. But I think of all of that, where Natasha Filipovna stands out the most to me is in this intellectual and intelligent downfall that she experiences. Natasha is without a doubt one of the smartest characters that everybody's interacting with here. And in terms of that intelligence that she possesses and the way that she wields that, she engages in almost this philosophical downfall. You can tell that Natasha is wildly smarter than most of the male characters she's interacting with, and that is not necessarily to her benefit. The way that she interacts with those expected roles in society is very iconoclastic, and Natasha Filipovna is a really, really fascinating character for me. I think the prince and Natasha, their interactions, how they play off of each other when it comes to order versus chaos, when it comes to, emotional intelligence versus intellectual intelligence, and those sort of interweavings, is really, really interesting. A third character here who's very important is Rogozin. Let me make sure I'm pronouncing that correctly before I mess that up. Rogozin, maybe. And Rogozin is the antithesis to the prince. He is filled with anger, filled with resentment. He's deeply reckless, and in that antithetical way kind of flirts with this destructive nihilism. And we see, I think of these three characters as orbiting in each other's gravities, and you see them occasionally bouncing off of each other and colliding with one another in really dramatic ways. As they are all sort of taking their own trajectory. Rogojin is a tough character. He's deeply reckless, you really filled with a kind of hatred, and really is symbolic in The Idiot of that 19th century nihilism that we're so familiar with when it comes to Dostoevsky. And I think, those three individuals really provide for this really provocative and thought-provoking experience as a reader, because we see so many different motivations that the three of them have, and navigating those motivations is really, really bizarre. One final character that I'll mention, and I think I mentioned this character because a stereotypical thing that I see a lot of Americans thinking about with Dostoevsky is nihilism. And an anti-nihilist novel is something that Dostoevsky is really famous for. And there is a nihilist character in here who's an atheist who really, really, I think, is maybe the personification of what that assumption is of Dostoevsky's writing, and that it's Ippolit. He's a nihilist young man who's dying. And as he experiences the process of dying, he knows he's going to die. And how he embraces this nihilism in that process is really thought-provoking. That's sort of a background moment in this novel. Is Ippolit is always dying, and there's always something happening that is really charged with regard to Ippolit. Those characters, I think, should be enough to get you into this novel, but let me talk a little bit more about some of the themes and just highlight why I think some of them might be really relevant in our current moment today. The first one I mentioned is this duality of atheism and Christianity. This is a perennially difficult topic for Americans. I very hesitantly tell folks that I'm an atheist. I've had some frankly very uncomfortable interactions in my life with people who are very afraid of atheists. I've had interactions with individuals who ask me, why, so you don't have any morals? Where do your morals come from? And that lack of understanding is really prevalent in Dostoevsky's writing. I think as an atheist, I think that's one of the things that draws me to Dostoevsky's writing the most, is this idea that, the atheism is this complete rejection of everything. And what I think is happening here is a conflation of atheism and nihilism that is sort of rife throughout Dostoevsky's work, but it's also a feeling that is pervasive still in the United States. And I think that fear of atheism is unwarranted in the overall history. And I'm not here to be Bertrand Russell and try and convince you one way or the other. I think, as a spiritual person myself, which might sound like a contradiction to you Christians out there, I think that, to me, I sort of have a live and let live mentality. And I think these perspectives should be multitudinous. This is the world that we live in. There are all sorts of different expressions of morality. And I think one of the things that The Idiot does really well is explore those different expressions of morality and explore those different feelings. I feel a really significant connection to the Prince here because, I remember growing up and feeling this, this sensibility that we should be good to one another, that we should be kind and moral to each other, that we should treat each other with respect and kindness. And that is one of those, sensibilities that I think, feels in our current moment challenged. I think that there's a lot of resentment and anger and frustration between individuals in our society, and still standing up and still saying, no, I want to be kind to people because being kind is good. That is a very difficult, that can be a very difficult thing in American society right now. I think everybody who's watching this can recognize that beyond the shadow of a doubt. That, to me, is something that the Prince is experiencing really significantly. I think it's ubiquitous, regardless of what your religion is, how that interacts with your society, how that interacts with your psychology, how that interacts with your experience of your society and your psychology. to that end, it's really, you know, to me, this novel is less, I'm less interested in who's right, the Christian or the atheist, right? Does God exist? Does not God not exist? To me, I don't care as much about that. I care much more about how does your system lead you to a moral life? How does your system lead you to an experience of society that is one that advocates for the betterment of your common man, of your fellow person? And that, I think, is a really interesting thing that's going on here. And I think throughout most of Dostoevsky's writing, I think, how we interact with society is this huge, really important question that Dostoevsky is asking. And there is a theme throughout this novel, throughout the Idiot, that I think is really important to that end. And that is the theme of execution. The theme of capital punishment and these moments of exploring the psychology right before a criminal is executed. These are some of the most thought-provoking moments I've read in Dostoevsky and have stuck with me, and I'm thinking about them pretty much every day since I have finished this novel. That thinking through of the final moment of life, that is ubiquitous. It does not matter what religion you practice or don't practice, what god or gods you do not worship or do worship. That is a completely human feeling and a deeply human fear. To a certain extent, most humans, maybe, I don't know how much we want to guess, 99%, 99.9%, maybe less or more by a little bit, fear death. And this fear is natural. It's ubiquitous. It doesn't matter if we are 25,000 years ago or if we are today, that feeling persists. That is explored in such graceful detail here in The Idiot, where characters consider what it must be like to experience that final moment right before the end. And capital punishment is used as that sort of crux, as that image, which in and of itself is a deeply moral question. Is it morally acceptable in any society to have capital punishment? This, folks, is where I'm seeing the masterwork of Dostoevsky developing. This is where, for me as an atheist, I know that Dostoevsky is not very happy with atheists. This is where, for me as an atheist, I'm saying, okay, I'm still going to read. I'm still going to engage. I'm still going to think about it, because the philosophizing that's done here in The Idiot is so provocative and profound that I think it's going to leave you with really, really intense questions to ask. Really important, foundational questions to any person, regardless of where they're coming from. That, I think, is really, really key, really important. And it should be noted that Dostoevsky, during the period when he was arrested, was nearly executed. And this is coming from a personal place where Dostoevsky is very possibly, very likely reflecting on his own experience of seeing the end of his life. And this is an uncomfortable topic. This is absolutely taboo topic that not a lot of individuals are interested in exploring, but I think is really important for us to explore in our contemporary moment, because we really do need to remember that even with the internet, even with the ubiquity of media we have, even with the resources we have, the privilege that we experience as individuals in this life, we still have those same fears, those same pressures, and those same dangers that are present in The Idiot. Those same dangers of being judged by our fellow person. Those same dangers of the society and government killing you. Those persist. Those remain ubiquitous threats and dangers and fears that all of us experience in our society. Now, this novel, if you've read Crime and Punishment, this novel is more polyphonic than Crime and Punishment, but it's not as polyphonic as Brothers Karamazov and Demons. So on a different thread, I think if you're looking for a little bit more of that Russian polyphony, you don't quite want to dive into War and Peace, you don't quite want to dive into Demons yet, I think The Idiot is a great introduction to that polyphonic voice. I think it's a great place for you to start ruminating on the many voices here, because one thing that I think, like Demons, and like Brothers Karamazov is present in this, that's not as present in Crime and Punishment, but still is to a certain extent, is we see an instance where there's like 30 people gathered around and everybody shares their different experiences. One of those moments that I think is really heartbreaking for me is a moment where the prince reads a slanderous letter that was written to a newspaper about himself. Somebody wrote to this newspaper sort of deriding the prince, and the prince reads it out loud. It's sort of read out loud in the company of the prince. And that moment, the polyphony, all those voices, all those different opinions going into that moment is so heartbreaking. It's like this really tragic Greek chorus that are all dealing with Prince Myshkin and his experience of society. I think that is a really, really great way to be introduced to polyphony, to be introduced to Russian polyphony and be able to reckon with those different voices. I think it's really, really thought-provoking and really, really beautiful and sad. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the video that this novel might be one of David Bowie's favorite novels. And I have to highlight that, when David Bowie and Iggy Pop were living in Berlin, experiencing life there. Maybe if you listen to David Bowie, maybe you listen to Iggy Pop, you might know of a David Bowie produced Iggy Pop record that is called The Idiot. The title is taken from here. Both Iggy Pop and David Bowie are reading this novel. And I think if you're engaging in that era of David Bowie's work, in that era of Iggy Pop's work, I think you do owe yourself a read of this, because a lot of that characterization that David Bowie had, a lot of that performance that David Bowie had, has a little bit of that bitterness, a little bit of that sadness, and that Berlin era of David Bowie is definitely influenced by this novel. Without a doubt, there is a lot going on here when it comes to thinking through what's going on here. And I do recommend that. And that to me, I think that connection, because I love David Bowie, really shows the interconnectedness of our forms of art. And I have talked a little bit about this on the channel, but I want to highlight this more, which is that our forms of art, music, literature, sculpture, painting, theater, ballet, all of these are so deeply interconnected. And to me, being a novelist, one of the most important life practices that I have is consuming as much art as I can. I want to see how the musician does this. I want to see how the painter does this. I want to see how the novelist, the poet, the ballerina, everybody does that. How do they portray sadness? How do they explore psychology? How do they interact with philosophy? How do they comment on politics? And that give and take, that interplay between forms of art is super duper essential. Maybe if you're struggling to get your novel written out there, maybe you need to be consuming more art in different places. Maybe you need to be going and looking at paintings. Maybe you need to be watching films, and trying as best you can to interact. Because when you read The Idiot and then you listen to The Idiot by Iggy Pop, and then you listen to the Berlin albums that are by David Bowie, you see this interconnection. And this is almost an artistic discourse between individuals. It's almost Dostoevsky commenting on psychology, and then Iggy Pop and David Bowie responding in a way to Dostoevsky, but in a different form, in that sonic form. And I think that is a really essential interaction that we have as artists, is with each other. So my sleeper recommendation here is read The Idiot and listen to some Iggy Pops. Read The Idiot and listen to some David Bowie, because I don't think you can go wrong there. Now, some other recommendations that I have here. The first one I think is going to be really important. I've done a video on this, and that is Das Schloss, The Castle by Franz Kafka. Another protagonist who is absolutely abused and maltreated. The key difference here is that the protagonist of Das Schloss, of The Castle, is mistreated by bureaucracy. This and The Idiot, they go hand in hand to my taste. And the treatment of the individual is really striking here. I would really heartily recommend reading The Castle. And I've got that video down below for you folks. The next novel that I'm going to recommend is A Personal Matter by Kenzaburō Oe. I like this edition. It's got multiple Oe novels in there. A Personal Matter I've recommended before on the channel, and I'm recommending it again. It is about a father who is wrestling with some very complicated issues relating to his child. And that novel is so sad in how it explores an individual psychology, much like how the individual psychology of the prince is explored here in The Idiot. I really felt a kinship between these two, where the prince is kind of a man versus society, a person versus society situation. In A Personal Matter, it's very person versus society, person versus self. I really think, if that sort of emotional read is important to you, I think reading A Personal Matter by Kenzaburō Oe would be really important. Overall, I really think Dostoevsky's relevance to our moment is in the psychology. I think, in my opinion, as a novelist, I do think we have maybe lost touch a little bit with psychologizing in our fiction. And I know that there's very psychological writers out there. And I know that is, definitely a part of popular culture is using therapy language. I think Dostoevsky is doing this in a more serious mode than we might see individuals on various socials talking about psychology. That wellness language, I commented on this a little bit earlier, that wellness language can be a little poppy these days, especially for Americans. I notice a lot of sort of pop culture talk about therapy language and use of therapy language in sort of pop ways. And I have to say, as a person who's gone through a lot of therapy, who will probably still continue to go through a lot of therapy, we need to attach a level of seriousness to that in order to have a productive time of it. We have to take that unpacking of our psychologies seriously, as a serious task, as a serious intellectual and philosophical task. And reading The Idiot by Dostoevsky could be a good way to get ourselves into that mode, to treating that discussion of psychology that much more seriously and with that much more heft. Because I think, going back to Prince Mishkin being called an idiot on almost every page, at a certain point, you might be sitting there saying, George, why would I sign up for that? Why would I even get in there? And, of course, the prince justifies who he is time and time again, and attempts to describe his feelings to these various individuals throughout this novel. That position that the prince finds himself in, I think that is important for us to explore, because it's important for us to consider what it would be like to be in that position, or perhaps what it is like for us in that position. Society's tough right now. Things are tough. We are seeing all sorts of instances of madness all around us. And I'm hearing the counter arguments. Things used to be worse. Things used to be so much worse. And that remains true. That doesn't detract from the fact that there is, time after time, the experience of madness around us. Things having been worse doesn't mean things aren't bad now. This is a complicated thing to accept. This is a complicated thing to quantify as individuals in our society, as writers, as people, as readers. Observing the prince, looking at Prince Mishkin, seeing how he and Natasha and Rogojin interact, seeing the madness that they cause in each other, seeing how they respond to that madness. This is a difficult emotional task. I would say this novel really, it was upsetting to read, and it was difficult for my heart to read it. But in our moment now, it's necessary. We owe it to ourselves as individuals in a society to engage with art, to enrich ourselves intellectually, to guard against this happening to us, to have the vocabulary to be able to quantify when it is happening to us and how this is happening to us. To me, that is a valiant and important call when it comes down to saying, I need to read this to better prepare myself for my day-to-day. That is a really valid and important reason to engage in art. To better understand your life and the society that you're in, these are essential parts of our interaction with art. And The Idiot is one of those novels that I think is really important for you to read. I want to thank you for hanging out with me today and engaging with some art. I want to encourage you to read my novel, Always the Wanderer. And if you want to support me, the best way to do it is to buy this novel, talk about it with your friends and your fellow readers. And I want to encourage you to take the leap and start reading some Dostoevsky, and start with The Idiot, of all places. I think it is a really worthy read. I'm going to do more deep dives on the other Dostoevsky masterworks. I think that they are also very, very relevant. And I want to thank you. So keep an eye out for those other Dostoevsky deep reads. Check out my Dostoevsky advice down below, and I will see you later. Thanks so much, folks.